everyone, welcome to the October 26th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona, here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and this week we are looking ahead to yet another Pick 5 sequence at Keeneland. We've done a few of those in the month of October, and on Saturday, I think it's the closing day of their meet in Lexington, Kentucky, and 3 stakes races carded as part of this late Pick 5 sequence, those being the Bowman Mill for the 2-year-olds, the Grade 3 Bryan Station for 3-year-olds on the turf, and a super interesting edition of the Grade 2 Fayette Stakes going 9 furlongs on the main track for older horses. But also in this sequence, there's a maiden race, full field to close it out, as well as a high-level allowance optional claimer that is also quite competitive. So not an easy sequence, Craig, and I think we used up a lot of our good luck and good karma last week, giving out that sequence on last Saturday at Keeneland, which ended with that magical run from Zumbi in the finale. And I know we were quite pleased about that, and I'm sure our listeners were too.
Yeah, I know you had mentioned offline, maybe that got the payoff a little bit because it definitely paid a little below the parlay. And I will say about this sequence, last week after we did it and we posted it, I almost went on to X there, or formerly Twitter, and said, I have a really good feeling about this sequence. And I decided against it because it just, you don't want to have to eat those words, but it turned out right. And as a handicap this week's, it is the complete opposite. It is a very difficult sequence, in my opinion. We're going to muddle through it, but I would suspect that I will be doing more vertical playing than I will pick 5 playing for this one, unless something changes before Saturday and maybe the races change, because for me, it's just a really difficult sequence.
Well, we don't want to spend the whole podcast reliving last week, but I totally get what you're saying, Craig. I mean, when we were handicapping it together, it just kind of felt like we were agreeing a lot. We were seeing things the right way. And I mean, even in like the middle of that sequence, that turf allowance race, I mean, typically I wouldn't want to nearly single a horse like the Sinfiltre that won, but it just seemed like things were clicking. That maiden race where you just selected the 3 right horses, and obviously you have to be right a few times to get to the finale and have, well, the confidence like you did to really key on a horse like Zumbi. I think you were alive to fewer horses than I was in that leg, but I mean that just felt like the kind of race where all of the favorites were so up against it from a pace standpoint that something weird could happen, and it's not like either of us were so confident that long shot could get it done, but it just felt like a really viable outcome in a race where there were so many variables and things working against those shorter prices. So great that it all worked out. And also, it's really cool, Craig, that just kind of looking back at 2023, 2 of the biggest scores that I've had in my personal wagering this year were pick 5s that we gave out on this podcast, both last Saturday and going back to that Louisiana Derby day where South Lawn won and Kings Barnes won the Louisiana Derby that day, when we pretty much gave out the pick 5 sequence as it came through. I think that one paid over $5,000. This one just over $7,800. So I mean, those are the kind of scores that can make your year. So just kind of cool to be able to share those. I mean, I'm a public handicapper. You do some public handicapping in your line of work. And that's the part of the fun of the game, when you give out a ticket either with your friends or with people that you like to talk about the races with, those being our listeners of the podcast, and you're able to make a score together. Maybe it reduces your payout by a little bit, but it makes it fun.
I agree. To me, it's worth it. I mean, I know we both put a lot of work into this sport and we take it seriously. And, pick 5s are hard. I mention it all the time. They're and it's something you have to be able to accept when you're going to play these bets. It took me a little while to do that. You're not going to hit a lot of them. So when you do hit them, you want them to pay. And Saturday was a good one. So hopefully we'll have a few more going forward because, like I said, they're hard and they will continue to be hard.
Well, I concur with your sentiments about this pick 5 on Saturday, this upcoming Saturday, because it is not easy to navigate. Let's begin with that 6th race, the Bowman Mill, 6 furlongs on the dirt for the 2-year-olds. And this is a really difficult pace projector to read, Craig, because you've got all of the main contenders that are shown up close to the pace in a fast-paced situation. And then when you go and look through the past performances, it sort of feels like they're all need the lead types. So something has to give, but it's not like there's some obvious closer that's supposed to take advantage of the situation. So it's really difficult to separate these contenders.
It is, and when I went back and looked at these fields, it's a tough pace projector, and I think the horse a lot of people are going to want to default to is Normandy Hero because he ran a very good race last time when he beat Valentine Candy, and he was able to rate a little off the pace, but I almost wonder if that was, watching the replay, just circumstances that he wound up in behind that piece. Not sure that's where he really wanted to be. He draws inside, so I wouldn't want to go too crazy on a horse that's going to be a short price, assuming he's going to be the off the pace horse. And the other thing that gives me a little bit of pause is it is just a 6 furlong race. If this race was 6.5 or even 7, I would feel a lot more confident taking some off the pace horses. But I understand those that want to lean on Normandy Hero, but I would have a little trepidation because there's just no saying, especially from that inside draw, that he's not going to break good and wind up being the target instead of the chaser.
Yeah, I was kind of going through that same thought process. He just got such a perfect trip last time. Everything worked out, riding the rail the entire way. I mean, he rated, but he was kind of always half in that spot inside of horses, and the rail opened up for him to come on through in the stretch. I don't know if he's truly an off the pace type, like you were saying. He really has been more of a speed horse early in his career. He did draw the rail last time. He drew the rail prior to that. He's drawn the rail again. He's a horse that just loves to draw the rail. But I would imagine they'll try to rate him again, just given the fact that it worked last time. We'll see if he's able to have things work out quite as perfectly as they did then. I didn't think he ran any better than Valentine Candy, who was setting an honest pace that day and actually really tried to battle back when Normandy Hero passed him in the stretch. It's just Valentine Candy, I think he's proven he's a horse that really does need to be on the lead, and he's the one that's kind of under the gun because he's got 2 speeds, actually 3 or 4 speeds rather, drawn all outside of him that are going to be going. So it's, in a way, you could argue that Valentine Candy is the one that's going to have the toughest trip of all. But I'm not sure that Valentine Candy isn't the best horse in this race. So it's tough to leave him out because I'm not sure who the horse that's going to get the right trip is. I'll just throw out a horse that I was kind of trying to make and get to, but at the end I ended up veering away from. That's the number 7 Cows, because he does feel like one of the few horses in this race that has passed horses come from off the pace. He's just done it on the turf. Is he a dirt horse? I don't really know. He ran fine last time in the Indian Summer. He sort of got there in mid-stretch and then couldn't quite kick for the final eighth of a mile with Committee of One and Amidst Waves, who we'll probably see in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint. Cows, though, while he does have plenty of dirt pedigree, I'm not sure that he really strikes me as a dirt horse. I went back and watched Saratoga Live from his debut day when it wasn't Maggie, but it was Acacia doing the paddock report. And she was saying that this horse has a turf hoof. She actually liked him on the turf. So that gives me a little bit less confidence with him going to the dirt. And he had worked well on the dirt prior to that race, but they still elected to run him on the turf. And at the end of the day, he'd have to be better on the dirt than he is on the turf to be effective here. So I was initially thinking he was the kind of horse I was going to land on, but I ended up going away from him.
We're very similar, so I'm getting a little scared already. But I had the same thought. I watched his races. He looks like the logical horse. There's some dirt breeding in there, but he wasn't for me when I watched his races. And you saying what Maggie did makes me feel even more confident. I mean, he's going to be a price. He's a wild card. I can't blame people if they want to use him in the pick 5. If I had to make a top pick in this race, I'm going to a horse dead in the middle of the field, and that's the 5 horse Patriot Spirit. He stretched out in the Iroquois last time, ran off, set a fast pace, and to me, that just told me he is probably a sprinter. When I look back at his debut at Colonial, that was actually a pretty strong maiden race. He won in a romp. The horses in behind him have come back to run very well. Some winners with improved speed figures. The runner-up came back to run a good second with an improved speed figure. A horse named Linzer at the Keeneland meet lost to Bergen, a Brad Cox trained horse. So he's one who, in his debut, he was able to sit off of what was a quick pace, just sitting in second, but a pretty clear second. I could see him getting a 2 or 3 wide trip here in the clear, and he's got the speed figures to make him competitive. So looking for a little value, I think Patriot Spirit is my top pick.
I wanted to like Patriot Spirit in this race, and I was kind of going in that direction until I watched his replays because he was impressive on debut, but this is a horse that is extremely aggressive. And I wish they were taking the blinkers off or doing something in this race because even in his debut, I mean, Jesus Caston was having a tough time rating him off one other horse. I mean, he wanted to go every step of the way, and he tried to hold him last time in the Iroquois, and he just couldn't. I mean, this horse ran off on him. And I get that turning back to the 6 is probably going to be better for him because it gives him a chance to sort of get into a more comfortable rhythm, not trying to run away from the field, but running with the field. And he is drawn well outside of his main pace rivals, so that's a good thing. But I just worry a little bit about this horse's demeanor because he seems like he's all go right from the start, and I do kind of want a horse that I know can finish in this race. And I'm not sure it's him. So at the end of the day, Craig, I just kind of threw the pace projector out the window and was like, who do I think is the best horse in this race? And I think the best horses in this race are Valentine Candy, Royal Slipper, and Glengarry. And we already talked about Valentine Candy. Royal Slipper, she was so fast out of the gate on debut. I mean, she was like a length in front of the field as soon as they opened the barrier. And she just easily set what was a fair pace. I mean, she certainly wasn't blazing a trail up front. It was a pretty even pace in TimeformUS. But she was just always in hand, always looked so much superior to that field. And it seems like a good sign that Wesley Ward is taking this filly late in the season and running her against the males. She's got a big pedigree. She's a full sister to Bast, who was a multiple grade 1 winning 2-year-old on the dirt. And she just feels like a horse that might have more versatility than we saw from her on debut. And I just think there's ability there. And then Glengarry, he ran a competitive figure last time at Prairie Meadows. Sure, he was beating nothing, but when you go and watch that replay, this is a big, imposing son of Maximus Mischief. I mean, we've seen a few of these Maximus Mischiefs that look like they're very much of the Into Mischief line, like highly developed as younger horses, and he really fits that mold. I mean, he just towered over his foes, and I know that he won both of those races, just getting his things his own way on the front end, but he was powerful in victory last time, and I'm not going to be surprised when this horse is able to make the transition to step up in class. And look, I don't know if the trip is going to work out for them. I don't know if the trip is going to work out for anybody, but in that situation, I'd rather just go to the horses that I think have the most ability.
Yeah, I've got no problem with them. I would say I'm a little more against Royal Slipper than you are. She's a filly stepping in against boys, which isn't that big of a deal. I'm just not sure what was in that field that she beat. She did go off, I think, favored that day, and nobody's come back to run since, so it's hard to get a real handle on it. But just my impression that she would have to improve quite a bit, so I'd be more against her. Glengarry, sure. The one thing I'd say about him is of all the horses that have the running lines that show speed, he's one that I think might be able to rate a little bit. He's just been so much better than the horses he's been beating that he probably just found himself on the lead more than went to the lead. So I would give him a little more chance. And just one more note on Patriot Spirit. One of the things that swayed me a little bit to make him the top pick was the change in jockeys. Nothing against Castanon, but Flavian Pratt is an upgrade, and if anybody could handle this horse and maybe get him to read a little better, I think it could be him.
Yeah, this is a race that I want to spread in, Craig. There's nobody that I'm leaning strongly on. I want to use multiple A horses. I want to use some backups. I could even throw in a horse like Maycox Bay as a B or a C because while he's also a speed type, he just doesn't look fast enough to keep up with them early, and maybe he's a horse that adjusts well to coming from a little off the pace, being drawn outside. He certainly ran a speed figure last time that puts him in the mix. So, I mean, there are just a lot of horses that I could see winning this race, so it's more a leg that I want to survive than a leg that I want to try to force some opinion that's going to come back to bite me later.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I will use several if I even play the ticket because I don't really have a strong opinion. I think a lot of different things could happen, and mostly I'm going to be watching the first quarter mile because I think the pace is going to be fascinating.
Move on to the next leg of this sequence. We're still sprinting on the dirt, but this one's going 7 furlongs for the older horses. Optional claiming 150,000 with an allowance condition attached to it. I actually don't think anybody is in for the $150,000 tag, so it's basically just an allowance race. This is an interesting one from a pace standpoint as well, Craig, because we do have some speed in here. Dr. Oscar feels like the quickest of the quick early, but 7 furlongs feels like it could be a bit of a stretch for this horse. I mean, he's got a lot of early speed, but he's generally run his best races at Canterbury. Hasn't necessarily taken it other places when they've shipped him, like to Oaklawn or last time to Keeneland for the Phoenix. And I'm not sure this race came up much softer than the Phoenix did. So I think he's going to have to show up again. And if a horse like him blazes the trail and then falls apart a little bit, I think it could open this race up to some off-the-pace types.
I agree with you. I like Dr. Oscar in the Phoenix. He did not show up. He had a little bit of a tough trip dueling with Sibelius, the horse that won that sprint in Maiden this year, but he hasn't really been the same horse since that day, since he shipped back to the States. So a little bit of a disappointing effort. And while I agree he'll be the pace setter, nothing in his PPs tells me that he's a horse that wants to go 7 furlongs. But I do think there's some pace, which could benefit a few other horses in here. I'm going to hold off on making my top pick because I have a feeling where you're going to go, and we probably are in agreement on that one, but we'll see. So I wanted to talk about a couple other horses first that are interesting, but are coming off of layoffs or second off a layoff. The first horse is the 2-horse Tragar. He's shown nothing but good races in his PP since his debut. He didn't run much in his debut. He pressed a fast pace, but that was a race won by Spirit of McKenna, who's actually went on to be multiple stakes winner, I believe graded stakes winner, if memory serves. He's done very little wrong since, but he comes in off a pretty long layoff for trainer Mark Glatt, who's shipping him in. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. When I looked him up for horses that have been off at least 180 days, he wins at 19% with a 1.92 ROI. So not profitable, but certainly not a negative. This horse is going to be one of the favorites in here. So I don't want to totally dismiss him just on talent alone. And then another horse I was interested in, and part of this is because of the pace, was the 8-horse Top Gunner. I think he may be the horse who's pressing Dr. Oscar the most. And frankly, his last race in the Phoenix just looks terrible. He had a bad start, didn't do much running after that. But when you look up his trainer, John Ortiz, in the in Formulator, he does much, much better second time off of a layoff like this one. First off the layoff, he wins at 13% with a 1.5 something or other ROI. Second time off these layoffs, he's 23% with a 2.21 ROI. So I think when you mix that in with the with the tough trip that he had last time, I think he's sitting on a big one and could be run a much better race. He certainly had some back races that make him competitive. So that's it. I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, you know me too well, Craig, because I'm sure you're aware that I'm picking Obesos in this race. But I just want to comment first on the 2 horses that you brought up. Top Gunner, he's another tough sell for me at 7 furlongs because I get the argument that he needed the last race, but even going back to him last year, you might remember, I mean, this is a horse that was notorious for making this big move to the lead in mid-stretch and then shutting down in the last furlong going 6. I mean, he feels like a horse that wants 5 furlongs. So I'm a little concerned about the 7 for him, especially with just the one race under his belt and him seeming so rusty last time. So that's a bit of a problem. I do think Tragar is really interesting in this race. I mean, for all the reasons you said, with Mark Glatt doing well off layoffs. And I mean, to take a horse like this that's training in Southern California and ship him across the country for this race, I mean, I guess part of it is to get a race you're eligible for because he's already won 3 times. But to me, it speaks of having some confidence in the fact that this horse is going to show up. And he's kept good company. I mean, he faced Straight No Chaser 3 back. I mean, obviously that horse went to the sidelines, but there was a time when it looked like he might be one of the top players in the Breeders' Cup Sprint. Obviously that division has changed quite a bit since then, but I mean, he beat a good horse last time. And coming off the layoff, I've watched a couple of his workouts from, just over a month ago, and it seemed like he was doing well. So I think he's very dangerous in this race, but Bezos just makes a lot of sense. look, he's not going to be 10-1. He could be the favorite in this race. He's probably supposed to be 4-1, 7-2. I could even see him going off lower than that. I mean, he just makes so much sense in here. There's pace. It's supposed to come apart a little bit, especially given the questions about some of the speeds going 7 furlongs. And he's run well when they've turned him back in the past. He was third in the Commonwealth over this course and distance back in 2022. He was fifth in the Breeders' Cup Sprint. I mean, this horse is going to... There's no way he's anywhere near double digits in this spot. And then you can make an excuse for the last race because a mile, it's a little far for him. And also there was no pace in there behind Zozo, so that was just the wrong setup for him. I really liked his race off the layoff, 2 back when he was closing behind Hear My Song at Ellis Park. And I just think he's the most likely winner of this race. So he's definitely an A for me. And I would also use Traeger pretty strongly. There are a couple other horses I want to mention, Craig, but it's the kind of race where most of my play is going to go through the 2 and 9. I know it's nothing clever because I'm kind of acknowledging that they're probably going to be the 2 favorites, but I think they deserve to be.
Yeah, those would be my 2 A's in the race, and Obesos would be my top pick for all the reasons you mentioned, and particularly that race at Ellis, which was at a time when the rail was just a paved highway, basically. There was no pace in that race. He was wide. He still almost got the job done against Hear My Song, gets an extra half furlong for this one. Um, can totally line through the last race against Zozos. Very similar, no pace whatsoever. Made a wide middle move, just obviously ran out of steam at that point, but with an excuse. So I agree he's not going to be 10-1, but I don't know if maybe I'm optimistic he could be 9-2. Hopefully I'm right, but I could be wrong on that too. But I think he makes a ton of sense in here. I'm curious who else you wanted to mention because those 3 that I mentioned is about it, the 2 A's, and I would still use Top Gunner as a B, just thinking he's going to inherit a lead. He'll probably fold up like he usually does, but maybe he'd get brave.
Yeah, I mean, unless Traeger is really live, who else is supposed to be a shorter price than Obesos? I don't know. I mean, I know Chasing Time is my racehorse, and sometimes he takes some money, but I mean, he was easily beaten by Obesos 2 back. Chasing Time is just like too random for me. I mean, he's been beaten by a number of these horses before. He's got that one big race at Ellis 3 back, but I don't know where that came from. His other surrounding form does not match up to it. So he's not for me in this spot. The 2 other horses I was going to mention, Craig, that I would use mostly as backups are Fortin Hill, who is another horse that does have those races somewhat randomly that make him really competitive here. One of them did come at Keeneland 3 back when he was off a layoff this spring, won a similar allowance race pretty convincingly. And when you look through his form, he is a horse that generally does some of his best running when he comes off a freshening. And that's how he's coming into this race. Paulo Lobo, always dangerous. A trainer that I like to call a horse player's friend because he just has nothing but high ROI stats. So I always try to find a reason to throw his horses in. So I think Fortin Hill is a horse that you could make enough excuses for to use him somewhere. And also the number 7 Pro-Oxidant is a little slow on speed figures, admittedly, but he didn't get the best trip in the Commonwealth when he tried this distance at Keeneland back in April. He was just losing position down inside on a race that was dominated by horses moving outside. I thought he came back and ran well in that Churchill event back in June. Wrong setup again at Charlestown, and now he's getting into a race that's supposed to feature a little bit of pace. Again, he would have to run a career best race to be a factor here, but I think he's maybe going to drift up off that 8-1 morning line, whereas I think some others are going to drift down a little bit. So if he's a price in here, he's one that I would want to include as a B or a C type.
Fortin Hill, I can definitely see, particularly with that Keeneland form he showed this spring. And I think you make a great point. As you were talking, I was looking back, and all his best races come off the layoff, and then he seems to kind of regress until he gets another layoff. So he's coming off a short one here. Totally get it. At the end of the day, Pro-Oxidant, I am a speed figure guy, and he's got a long way to go, so he would be a stretch for me.
Now we come up to the 8th race, back into the stakes portion of this sequence. It's the Grade 3 Bryan Station going a mile on the turf course, and there is a key question that needs to be answered in this race, Greg, and that is More Than Looks running here, or is he running in the Breeders' Cup Mile? because he was pre-entered in the Breeders' Cup Mile. We earlier today, we're actually recording this late on Wednesday, and earlier today we recorded our Breeders' Cup pre-entry reaction. I don't think we really talked about More Than Looks because he'd be a long shot in that race, but he was one deep on the also eligible list, and it's since been announced that a horse has been withdrawn that was pre-entered in the mile that made it into the field. So More Than Looks is technically in the Breeders' Cup Mile field. But is he running there or is he running here, where he is going to be likely a strong and deserving favorite? If More Than Looks runs in this race, he's kind of an easy lean because there is so much speed signed on in here, and he's a horse that really needs a pace setup to be most effective. And if this race stays together as drawn, he'll be really tough to beat.
I totally agree. And because of that, I sure hope he runs here because he is the one horse on the sequence I really wanted to lean on. I mean, he's just a very, very good 3-year old in a season that is full of them, but I've liked everything I've seen from this horse. I think he would be a standout. He's getting a very good pace set up. There's some other speed horses in here, and I several other speed horses in here, and I just don't trust any of the closers, other closers. So if he goes, he would be a hard lean for me, maybe even a single. I don't use a lot of singles. Maybe I'd use another B or C, but that would be about it. If he doesn't go in here, that totally changes things.
Yeah, and I do think we have to talk about the possibility that he comes out of this race, because if he does, this race becomes a real problem because you've got a lot of talented horses, but they all have tactical speed or front running speed. They want to be forward. I mean, the horse that's shown leading on the pace projector, I don't think is going to be leading. That's the number one talk of the nation because he's just a horse that is more content to stalk usually. But he does not want to come from that far off the pace, and probably Jose Ortiz is going to try to slot into the pocket right in behind, but talk of the nation, if you've watched his races, he's a very headstrong and aggressive horse, so I don't know how far back off the leaders Jose Ortiz is going to be able to wrangle him, and I think he's the second most likely winner of the race, but I worry that he's going to get sucked into a fast pace that might come apart.
I totally agree because there's a lot of other horses that want that same position. They either want to be on the lead or they want to be right in behind the lead, and you can only have so many doing that. So I from that inside post, I could easily see a scenario where he's forced to go too fast early. And if the rider isn't aggressive, if Jose Ortiz decides that he's going to let somebody else go, he could easily find himself sixth or seventh or even eighth in a field like this because there's just so much speed to his outside that I'm just not sure what he's going to do. And I would not want to take a short price on him in a field where others have run just as fast as he has.
Yeah, if More Than Looks does not run in this race, and I'll just say, I completely agree with what you said, Craig. If this race stays together and the speed holds together and More Than Looks is still in here, then I want to basically almost single More Than Looks. Maybe I'd use Talk of the Nation as a distant backup like a C, but I would want almost all of my play to go through More Than Looks because the rest of this sequence is crazy tough, and this feels like a leg that you could have some confidence in if it stays together as drawn. If it doesn't, I don't feel comfortable enough with Talk of the Nation. I would find myself having to upgrade a horse like the number 2 Gigante because he just feels like if the speed stays in and More Than Looks comes out, he just fits the race really well. I don't think he's as naturally talented as a number of horses in here, but we saw what he can do when he gets the setup 2 back in the Secretariat, able to win that race from off the pace. 9 furlongs maybe a little far for him last time in the Virginia Derby. That was also a really tough field, and he might just fall into the right trip. And he'll be a decent enough price, so he's a horse that I'd want to upgrade if More Than Looks comes out. Beyond those 2 inside drawn runners, it gets really tough to separate these horses.
Agree. Gigante, he is one that I was very interested in until I got to More Than Looks. And to me, I was just like, well, he's not out kicking this one if the pace sets up. But if it doesn't, like you said, I went back and watched his last race at Colonial. Looking for an excuse. I didn't really come up with one, except that it's probably too far, which you mentioned, and maybe his kick's just better at a mile, and a mile and an eighth is not for him, and his breeding maybe leans that way, being by not this time. So I could see him getting a good setup, and I would kind of default to having him on my ticket without more than looks. As for the others, there's nobody for me to get too excited about in here. I mean, Smokey Mandates run some fast races, but he's also one that needs to be up by the pace. Maybe I'd want to include him a little bit just because he's outside of Talk of the Nation. Maybe he could work out a little better trip, but it's just like I said from the start. I really hope more than looks stays because otherwise this sequence for me will be pretty much unmanageable.
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying about Gigante. I don't like his form that much. I think he's actually a little dressed up because he got such a great setup or trip in the Secretariat, and that also was just such a weird race where horses that looked better on paper didn't show up. There was that Cherie DeVaux horse, Northern Invader, that was the favorite in there, and I mean he's looked awesome since then, but for whatever reason he didn't handle Colonial that day. That feels like it might be a race that just lives in isolation. And if you take out that Secretariat, Gigante does not look that appealing in this race. So he's kind of a reluctant upgrade for me, or he would be if More Than Looks isn't in here. I actually think Smoky Mandate's a much better horse, and if I had some confidence that the trip would work out for him, he'd be a horse that I'd be way more happy to upgrade. And maybe I'm viewing him as being more one-dimensional than he is, because Smoky Mandate is a horse that was adept at coming from off the pace at least a couple of times earlier in his career, so maybe he has that versatility. And as I'm talking about it a little more, I'm thinking maybe Smoky Mandate's an even better upgrade than Gigante, but all of these are contingencies if More Than Looks scratches, and hopefully we get some clarity on whether that's happening or not between now and Saturday.
Yeah, I guess we could. There's not really anybody else I'm too interested in, but there are some horses people might be like a Praise who had some good form, ran second at Saratoga in a graded stake. Stash had some wins early, and including a graded stakes win at in the Transylvania at Keeneland. So, but it just seems to me like those haven't really progressed like some of the others we prefer.
Yeah, I tried to make some excuses for Mo Stash. I mean, he was part of that pace that came apart in the Secretariat, but I thought he was somewhat fortunate in a few of his prior races when he was having more success, and I don't like Appraise at all. I don't think he wants a mile. I'm surprised Chad's even running him in this race. He's not for me. Let's move on to race 9, the Grade 2 Fayette, and this came up a war. I mean, there is so much to consider in this race. I guess this is sort of the prep for the Clark, which I want to say is no longer a Grade 1. I think the Clark as a Grade 2 would be lucky to come up as tough as this race came up. I mean, there is contention runs very deep in here. And it's not like it's a race that has any standout horses. I'm not even sure who's going to go favorite in here. It seems very wide open. I think the morning line favorite, and a very lukewarm one at that, is the number 10 Trademark. And I can't really argue with that, Craig. I mean, the only thing is he's a horse that doesn't usually take that much money, but I mean, he's just been in great form recently. I mean, he ran really well in the Island 2 back, and I think he validated that performance by actually improving on it in the Lucas Classic last time. That was a fast pace. He was in close attendance to it, made the first move to break the race open at an upper stretch, and just got run down by a horse in Clapton who got a better trip than he did. Trademark has run well at Keeneland in the past. He makes a lot of sense. I don't know if I'd want to take a short price on him, but I kind of do concur that he's the horse to beat.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Would I be crazy to say that top to bottom, this race is probably as strong or stronger than the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile is shaping up? When you can, outside of Cody's Wish, he would obviously be a heavy favorite in here, but it's just deep and contentious. There's so many horses in this field who have run 120 plus Timeform US speed figures that it's a really tough one. And I'll just start with the inside because I think that's the horse that has the best Timeform US speed figures, and I know is the Timeform US power pick because of that in Film Star. And this is a horse I actually don't like a whole bunch, even though 6-1 on the morning line seems a little enticing. I'm just always leery of Linda Rice shipping when I looked her up in Formulator and excluded New York and Laurel and Philadelphia races, and just kind of when she ships out, it gets pretty ugly. I couldn't find a race that she's ever won in Kentucky. Maybe she has, and maybe I was doing something wrong, but there weren't many, and her stats are just not very good. I found she was 5 for 47 with a miserly 0.75 ROI on the $2. So, at a horse that, as a speed figure guy, I would normally want to jump on at what looks to be a decent price. I don't really care for Film Star.
No, I agree with that. I looked up some of those stats as well. She's 0 for 7 with all starters in Kentucky, which is kind of funny given that she claimed a lot more horses than that in Kentucky and had so much success with them. Actually, Film Star included, claimed out of the Keeneland April meet earlier in the year. But she doesn't run that many in Kentucky, and I think that's partly why they put in those new rules in Kentucky that basically the Linda Rice rule that's going to prevent her from doing as many claims from there as there had been. Yeah, I kind of agree. I mean, he ran a lot better than I was expecting in the Woodward because I thought he had gotten some very favorable pace setups in his 2 victories prior to that, but he really held his own against the tough field last time. I just wonder if that was the day to have him when he was 13-1 and held on for second. Now he's drawn the inside, plenty of other speed signed on. He's going to be more under the gun from that post position, and is he going to be able to translate that form outside of New York? I don't have that much confidence. So I'm kind of with you, Craig, that he's not really one for me. And I guess we can use him as a good way to transition to the other horses coming out of the Woodward. Law Professor, I thought, maybe ran the second best race that day because he had some real trouble into the clubhouse turn. A little bit of his own doing. He kind of got somewhat green and reacted badly to being rated for a few strides, but ran on well to just miss to Film Star at the end. But he's going out for another barn that I don't totally trust running in a graded stakes in Kentucky, and Rob Atras, who I know he is a trainer that has been having a cold streak in New York recently, but just over the past few years, he's a trainer that has had the majority of his success in New York and hasn't been quite as successful shipping.
Yeah, Law Professor. I actually bet a straight exacta Zandon over Law Professor last time, and I still don't know how I didn't cash on that one. And I'll be honest, part of the reason I did that is because I think Law Professor prefers a wet track. And even though that track's listed as fast, there was definitely some moisture in the track that day at Aqueduct in the Woodward. So that's the reason I bet he was a little bit definitely disappointing. I thought he had every reason to get second and just couldn't quite get by Film Star. And I'll agree with everything you said about his just not Rob Atras not doing all that great when he ships. So I think that would be another question mark. One thing we haven't mentioned is the pace, and the pace projectors predicted a fast pace, I think, for all 4 of the races we've talked about. And this one, maybe not quite as clear cut. We do show a lone leader in Best Actor, but it's going to be tough for him because he draws the 12 hole. He's going to have to clear some other fast horses. And because of that, I'm just looking for a horse that's maybe has some tactical speed, but going to come from off the pace. And the horse I've kind of landed on as my top pick is the 3-year-old El Miracolo. I just don't see why he can't step up and beat some of these horses. He's a horse who's been getting better all year. He won the Smarty Jones easily, went into the PA Derby on a sloppy track, came from off the pace, ran what I consider a pretty good third, matched his speed figure from the Smarty Jones that day. And I just think he's going to get a nice setup. I know he's 6-1 on the morning line. I think he's probably going to be longer than that.
Yeah, I could certainly see his price drifting up. And I agree, he's an interesting horse in this race. I do kind of want to see him take that form outside of Parks, but perhaps it's just him improving at the right time. I mean, you'll remember, Craig, I thought this was a horse that had run a lot better than it seemed in a few races this spring and summer. He had subtle trips in the Florida Derby and the Belmont, and I mean, since then, he's kind of really figured things out. I would have liked to see him finish a little better in the Pennsylvania Derby, but he still held his own that day, and I think he's a horse that might, especially given the strength of the 3-year-olds that we've seen already stepping up against some older horses, he's a horse that definitely merits consideration in a race like this. I'm going to differ with you a little bit with the pace, Craig. I think this pace really is supposed to heat up. And I mean, there are multiple horses in this race that have achieved success with front-running tactics recently. Film Star, Giant Game. I know they tried rating last time, but he's a horse that won 2 races in gate to wire fashion. You've got to think that the instructions are going to be to go again. Twilight Blue has tactical speed. Speed bias, really, I mean, he's kind of proven he can't pass horses. He needs to be forward. You go to the outside. I know Dash Attack is not really a speed, but he did win a race in gate to wire fashion last time. And then Best Actor, again, coming off a gate to wire victory, draw him the outside post. Maybe Brad Cox scratches him because he's been known to do that when the post doesn't work out. But I mean, if he stays in here, he's supposed to be under the gun from the outside. He's actually the one shown leading on the pace projector. So to me, it feels like there are enough horses that have to be forward for this pace to heat up a little bit. Does it completely fall apart? I don't know. If it does, I think the one horse that we haven't talked about from the Woodward merits some consideration, the number 9, O'Connor. I don't know if he's going to be... I have trouble seeing him being 5-1 in this race, basically the same price as Trademark. It's Safi Joseph, not that he's been having a great Keeneland meet so far. But this is a horse that just kind of lost contact early in the Woodward, and that was a pace that didn't maybe fall apart as much as it was expected to. And he was running on at the end, but just was moving belatedly in this race, just given way too much ground to make up. And maybe that's just this horse. He tends to be a little sluggish, and he's running when the races are over. But I thought he ran well, too, back in the Charlestown Classic. That was a race that completely held together from a pace standpoint, and he was the only horse to make a significant run from the back of the pack. And he's going to get in a race here where he's supposed to get the right kind of setup. I just think he's interesting if he's around 8-1. I don't like him at 5-1, but I think he's going to be a bigger price than that just because he's not a horse that has any accomplishments that make him that sexy in this race. So he's one that I definitely want to use. And I guess you could also apply that similar logic to the number 2 Happy American, but I mean, he's even more of a deep closer. This horse has no early speed at all. I mean, it looked for a second like he was going to get pulled up early in the Lucas Classic. He was so far behind, and he was running on a little bit at the end. He had been fairly consistent, picking up pieces prior to that, and maybe he's sort of getting back to the right class level here, but he's one that really needs things to fall apart. I don't know how you were viewing some of those closers, Craig.
Yeah, just to be clear on the pace, I do agree it's going to be a fast pace, just not one to the level of the other 2 races that we've discussed that are particularly hot. The Bryan Station and that first stakes race for on sprinting. So yeah, they would be the two closers I would lean on after Il Miracolo, who I think would come from off the pace. I've got no problem with O'Connor. The 5-1 morning line turned me off a little, but again, I'm not going to knock Nick Tamaro for this morning line because it's a very difficult one. Wouldn't even know where to start if I was going to make it. But I still think he'll be a bigger price. And Happy American's kind of interesting. I'm not sure what happened to him last time. It was just kind of a clunker and first race in about 3 months. So I think he would be a lot harder to trust than O'Connor.
No, believe me, I don't want to make a morning line for this race. It's extremely tough. No, Happy American, if you can make that excuse for his last race that he was just rusty off the layoff, he actually makes a lot of sense in here, just needs the right pace setup, and we'll see what kind of price he is relative to O'Connor. Obviously not before we play the sequence, but we can at least have our opinions about that. I'm going to throw in one more horse, Craig, that might appreciate a setup in here. That's the number 3, King Fury. Maybe he just never went on from his 3-year-old season, and clearly he's done a lot of losing since he won a couple races as a younger horse, one of which was the Lexington over this course back in 2021. It looked like he was well on his way when he won that Bourbon Trail later that season by 13 lengths, but things just haven't really panned out for him as a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old. You can make some pace excuses for him, though, in recent races. I mean, you might remember that Mine Shaft was a race that kind of held together on the front end at the fairgrounds back in February. A mile too short for him, 3 back in the 5th season. He came back off the layoff last time and just got in a race where there was no pace. Dash Attack's his stablemate, not even a speed horse, but he was able to dominate up front that day. And King Fury was finishing at the end, but just was never going to be successful that day given the way the race set up for him. Now he's getting out to a 1.125, which I think he appreciates, getting into a race with more pace to close into, and he's just going to fly way under the radar. I mean, there's just not too much to recommend about him, but once upon a time, he was the kind of horse that could be competitive against a field like this, and maybe he'll be ready to step forward second off the layoff. Corey Lannery, not my favorite rider in every situation, but he sometimes can work out a pretty clever trip saving ground from off the pace on a horse. So especially in a situation where a race is collapsing. So he's a horse that I don't know if he's an A for me, but I want to use him somewhere because I think he's going to be the right price and can outrun his odds.
The positive I'd say for him, as you mentioned, is Bourbon Trail, where frankly, that probably wasn't a very, very good speed figure I made based on the run backs. It definitely looks too high, but even if you think it was 5 or 6 points too high, it was still his career best. Things definitely went south after that, particularly starting with the Clark. His whole 4-year-old season was a wash. He didn't really do any running. The beginning of his 5-year-old season. The upside would be that when he came back in that allowance race last month, he ran a speed figure better than anything we'd seen from him since the Clark. So maybe the time away did him so good. He did him some good. He did it against the flow that day. It was like you said, a race that was just dominated on the front end. So he definitely had some upside at a big price.
And I'll just say, we kind of skipped over Best Actor. There are a few horses that I said I think are going to be bigger prices than they're listed at. I think Best Actor is going to be shorter. I mean, with just going out for Brad Cox and Flavien Prat coming off a big win last time. I know we got a perfect setup, but those kinds of horses just generally take money. I don't trust him because he does feel like a horse that kind of needs things to go his way. I'm not sure they're going to from post 12, but I think he's a horse that you do have to have some opinion about because I do envision him taking some money in this race.
Yeah, I don't trust him from the outside post. Interesting, we have back-to-back Smarty Jones winners in this race. I'm taking one and tossing one.
Let's move on to the last leg of this Pick 5 sequence. It is a maiden special weight event for the 2-year-olds going a mile and a 16th on the turf. Again, a full field signed on with some also eligibles in the mix. This is a race that has a lot of interesting things going on from a pedigree standpoint especially, but I will say there are some horses with turf experience that look pretty good. Starting with the number 8, Active Mutiny, a horse that faced a good field on dirt on debut, but probably was turf meant, gets on the grass in his second race at Kentucky Downs, and I thought got a strange ride from Jose Ortiz because he broke well, and Jose just seemed intent on dragging him to the back of the pack. There was given the turf that day, so maybe he had some concerns about stamina for 2-year-olds running over that surface. I don't know, but they just elected to take this horse all the way back, and he was making a big run at the end, but it wasn't like it was a race that fell apart or anything. So he was doing some real running in the stretch that day. Now he's stretching out to a mile and a 16th. Everything in his pedigree says that this distance is supposed to work for him. So also getting a switch to Flavien Prat, maybe signaling a change of tactics. To me, he looks like a legitimate favorite. There are other horses I want to use because I think there are a lot of things going on with some horses that are bigger prices, but Active Mutiny is the horse I kept coming back to as the one that's going to be pretty tough to get around.
Yeah, Active Mutiny is definitely my top pick in here. We've talked about how tough the sequence is, and because of that, I mean, he's going to be my only A in here. Not just because I'm trying to limit the price. I mean, I do think you have to consider that when you make a ticket, but he is one of my stronger opinions in the field. I think in the sequence, I think he looks very strong in this field. I think I'm always a little distrustful of the races at Kentucky Downs as far as speed figures go, but his was fine, and I think it could have been a whole lot better. I found it interesting how much money he took on debut at Saratoga, knowing he was probably a turf horse. He obviously showed some talent in the morning, so for me, I think he is way the most likely winner.
Let's talk about some other horses that could take money in here. The number 5, Deadpan, he got, I think, the highest TimeformUS speed figure in this race on debut. You do have the F code attached to it, Craig, which for people that don't know, if you're using the TimeformUS PPs and you see a speed figure with a letter code attached to it, you can actually now click on that speed figure in the new version of TimeformUS on DRF.com, and it brings up an explanation of what that speed figure notation means. And if you click on the 98F for Deadpan, it indicates, as Craig has written here, that this was a race where you just can't have a lot of confidence in the number because it's almost all first time starters or inexperienced horses or those that haven't been on the surface before. So it's hard to make a projection. And when I look at the chart, Craig, that's a race that I wonder if the number's a little high.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, nearly every single horse, or I should say every horse who's come back to run again has regressed. Not a ton. They're all in about the 4 or 5 point range, some a little bit higher, 6, 7, 8. So I mean, it's not like it's miles off, but it's enough that I mean, I don't want any parts of deadpan in this field. He's a horse who pretty much had things his own way early in the race. He wasn't going all that fast, and he simply didn't finish it off. So it's not the kind of turf horse I'm ever anxious to bet when they come back.
A horse that I do think has some upside in here is the number 11 Vivaldi. I just wish he wasn't a Chad Brown horse because I feel like he's going to take money just by default with Chad and Tyler Gaffalione in his corner because he actually ran on debut like a horse that probably needed the experience. Was going to do better for it. He was just sort of always out of position, never really having a chance to move up. And when he finally started to make his run, he went extremely wide. That was a day when they had taken the rails down at Kentucky Downs, and he probably wanted to be down towards the inside. So I don't think he really had the best chance that day, and I think he's going to run better here. Is he as good as Active Mutiny? I don't know. And I feel like their prices are going to be too similar for me to use him on the same tier as Active Mutiny, but he's a horse that I could certainly envision improving quite a bit in this spot.
Yeah, I think he's the second most likely winner in here for the reasons you mentioned. It was Kentucky Downs. It was a day where the lane was, or the rail was where you wanted to be. He was wide on the track, and it's not like he ran terrible. The speed figure to me is completely irrelevant. Chad Brown doesn't run a lot of horses at Kentucky Downs. I mean, he finally did run some this year. There's been years where he ran none or one. So yeah, it seems like that was more just a prep to maybe get him ready for this exact race, and I expect him to run much better than what we saw there.
I'm going to throw out two more horses, Craig, that I was saying there are some interesting horses in this race, and they're both pedigree horses. And a little more than that because I've watched them and I think that their action and the way they run indicates that turf is going to be to their liking. We'll see if they're good enough. The first one is Time Song, the number 4 for Todd Pletcher, has run twice on the dirt in Kentucky, and neither start was that bad. I mean, these aren't respectable speed figures, but now they're trying something new, and the pedigree, I think, says that turf is where this horse is supposed to be. The Not This Times can do anything. Not This Time is like the new Speightstown. I mean, his progeny goes short, long, dirt, turf, it doesn't matter. But the dam side of this pedigree is strongly turf. Not so much from the first dam because there's just not a ton of production, but the second dam is a horse named Emerald Beach, who was, I believe, a stakes winner on the turf. She was a horse that wanted to run long on the grass. The dam out of Emerald, the dam who's a half sister out of Emerald Beach is a half to Be Up, who is a marathon winner on the turf. If you go a little deeper in this pedigree, it's the female family of Bricks and Mortar. So, I mean, there's real turf pedigree for Time Song. And I think this is a horse that really does have a right to move up on the grass. And then at an even bigger price, another horse that I like getting on the grass is the number 3 Wahatchee. Anchor Down, not really a known turf influence, but looking up in Formulator, does get 10% turf route winners. The dam side, again, not a ton of immediate production, but the second dam was all turf. The dam is a half to a horse named Bombagia, who was grade 2 placed on the turf going longer. And when I went back and watched not just this horse's debut, but also all the way back to the 2-year-old sale, this is a horse that looks like they must have had turf at the back of their mind because he looked kind of turfy in that 2-year-old sales work. And I know that, this isn't a kind of barn that's going to take a lot of money, as he didn't on debut. He went off at a huge price. So I feel like this is one that you could throw into your sequence somewhere and just guarantee that you're going to get some value because I feel like he does have a lot of upside on the turf and he's going to be a big price.
Well, thanks for making my ticket bigger, David. Just what I needed here in this spot. But no, I can see both of those. Time Song is the more obvious one, being Todd Pletcher trained, and he does well with these kind of horses. And the horse took plenty of money both of his first 2 times out, so there must be some talent there. But I'm always going to listen to you when you start diving into pedigrees and talking second dams, because that's just not something I'm into, and I rely on you in these situations.
Well, that wraps up this late pick 5 sequence, and now it's time to go back and try to put a ticket together, Craig. And I think as we were talking about the way we put a ticket together, well, whether we play it or not, you sound like you're a little on the fence about it, but it really is going to hinge on that middle leg and what happens in the Bryan Station with regard to More Than Looks, whether he runs or not, because I think it would set us on one of two different tracks if he runs or if he doesn't run.
Yeah, no doubt. If he doesn't run, the ticket would just be too big for me, and I would just be trying to force a ticket, and that's not something I want to do. But if he does run, I'm going to lean on him very heavily, so then I would play. So I just want to be clear on that. And unfortunately, we're recording on Wednesday, so we don't know. But by the time people listen, they should know if he's in or not, or have a pretty good idea. So I'll just talk about it like he is in, and if not, hopefully we gave out some good opinions for some vertical plays because that's how I would be playing. In the first leg, I have to spread a little bit in here. Like you said, I think Valentine Candy is probably the best horse. I wouldn't want to leave him off my tickets. I would give the Prairie Meadow shipper Glengarry a chance, but my top pick would be Patriot Spirit, who I think is going to handle the turn back pretty well with Flavian Prat. In the seventh race, the allowance race, it's a race where we both liked Obesos. We don't have any illusions that we're going to get 10-1 in here, but he just makes a lot of sense. And I would also use Traegar. I would have Top Gunner as a backup, fully admitting there's some reservations about the 7 furlongs, but I think he's going to outrun Dr. Oscar and kind of inherit the lead. So the Bryan Station, we kind of covered it. If More Than Looks is in, he would be my guy. If not, it's a race where maybe I'd be playing Gigante and Smoky Mandate. I think they might both offer some value, but that would be more as a vertical play. It would be very tough to have 4 or 5 races where I'm spreading. So in the ninth, I would lean on Il Miracolo. I'm totally with you on some of the other closers, though, particularly O'Connor, but I could, at a bigger price, I could use Happy American and even King Fury, who I thought you laid out a very good case for. It will be interesting to see if Best Actor runs. As you say, the post isn't ideal. Brad Cox kind of has a luxury to scratch when he wants to. I mean, it's a stakes race, so anybody can, but he can run his horses all over. He doesn't have to go here. But if he runs, I would definitely be looking for the closers. And the last race, I'm going to lean on the two, unfortunately, shorter price horses. Vivaldi more as a backup, but Active Mutiny as a pretty strong A in here. And then I would use the backups that you mentioned, Time Song and whatever. Wahachi, I guess it is. And then
That's what I went with.
yeah, Wahachi, that sounds right. And then Deadpan is the horse that I am definitely against in there because one, the speed figure's too high, and two, I just don't like how he packed it in when he had things his own way.
Well, I think Craig and I are pretty similar with this one. The first leg, it's just not a race that I'm trying to have a strong opinion in. I just kept running into a wall when I tried to get there. So I'm gonna just kind of key on the horses that I think have shown talent. The 2, 3, and 4, Valentine Candy, Royal Slipper, and Glengarry. And then my backups would be Normandy Hero, Patriot Spirit, and Maycox Bay. Just kind of going really deep in that leg and hoping to get through it. And moving on to the 7th race, most of my play is going to go through the number 9, Obesos. And Traegar, I'm kind of on the fence between using him as a co-A or maybe using as a B. And then the horse I'd use on like a deeper ticket are Fortin Hill and Pro-Occident. In the 8th race, the Bryan Station. So yeah, we got the 2 tracks here. Leaving the station, one of 2 ways. It's either going to be the number 9, More Than Looks, as my A, with Talk of the Nation as a C. If More Than Looks scratches, I would use Talk of the Nation as an A with Gigante and Smoky Mandate as the 2 Bs in all likelihood. And I'd probably try to get through the race with those 3 horses. But I would much rather More Than Looks stay in the race because I have much greater confidence in this race if it holds together as it's been drawn. In the Fayette, the 9th race, This is one where I'm going to have to do a little bit of thinking about how I'm going to split up the A's and B's, because we talked about a lot of horses. Just based on the value, I'm kind of leaning towards upgrading King Fury, as we've talked about it a little bit. I would use the number 9 O'Connor, who I think will get the right pace set up. The number 10 Trademark, who I just think makes a lot of sense in this race, even though he's going to be a shorter price in all likelihood. I thought Craig made valid points about the 7 Il Miracolo. I could kind of be on the fence about maybe using him as a B, and then Happy American, another horse that I could use as a B in case this falls apart a little bit. But a lot of the other horses that are going to be involved in the pace, I'm going to try to veer away from. In the maiden special weight, closing it out, the A would be Active Mutiny, and then as a B, I would use horses like Time Song, Vivaldi, and probably Wahachi, who is going to be that big price. So I haven't yet added it up to see how all of that comes together in Ticketmaker. Surely it will be less expensive if that 8th race stays together with More Than Looks in it, because having a horse that you're basically singling or just using as a lone A with 1C really does kind of turn it into a pick 4 sequence, which is much more affordable. But we'll see how that shakes out with scratches.
Well, that was pretty exhausting one, I would say. And luckily for us, that's it. Oh, we'll have some video previews to do. And just want to say, our listeners, I imagine we'll do some Breeders' Cup videos early next week. We have some race previews coming up this week, but just one more podcast from us before the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, I'll mention that again. I mentioned it at the end of our podcast that we did earlier this week, our Breeders' Cup pre-entries reaction podcast, that we will be doing another podcast early next week where we go through some topics surrounding the Breeders' Cup, pace scenarios, long shots we're considering, whatnot, trends. We'll talk about that early next week. As Craig said, we haven't yet gotten the video assignments for next week, but I imagine we'll be doing some videos on DRF's YouTube channel that you can check out. Our colleagues Dan Illman and Mike Beer and others, of course, will also be doing plenty of Breeders' Cup handicapping videos that you can find there. I'll also take this opportunity to mention that I'm doing a DRF betting strategies package for both days of the Breeders' Cup with Brad Free, who of course is very dialed into what's going on in Southern California. So we'll be kind of doing back and forth written analysis that you can find out more about on DRF.com, betting strategies for both Friday and Saturday of the Breeders' Cup. So a lot going on between now and then, but we're definitely looking forward to it. First, though, we're going to try to get through and have given out some good opinions on this Saturday sequence at Keeneland. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to the podcast this week. Remember, you can always catch these on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in. More to come next week.